Deltarune Chapter 3 and 4 have been out for over a month now, and so in the usual Toby Fox fashion, it brought many new mysteries with it. Many have started speculating on theories, and over the course of the last month, I believe that after watching multiple tens of hours of theory content, I've stumbled across fantastic evidence and speculation. As such, I've also come up with my own theories while doing so. While digging around, I've accumulated my own thoughts on what the story of Deltarune really has been. I won't say I'm 100% accurate with what I've come up with, but from what I've seen, this seems to make the most sense, and doesn't seem to conflict with each other in a massive way. From what I've gathered, all of these theories can link up with one another without massive holes in them. However, I'm not going to claim I'm correct, just that I've connected dots and that I think the story these theories create together is one worth telling. Whether you agree is up to your interpretation, and if you have better thoughts, I would love to be corrected on them. Because I just want to understand the story as much as I possibly can. Part of this speculation on my end is probably just linking things that A, make sense, and B, would fit Deltarune's story and make it better in my mind if these were to come true. This video is probably going to feel pretty disorganized too, and I apologize for that, I really do, because I have a habit of just writing whatever comes to mind at the moment when providing evidence and counter evidence. Also, for the last note I have here in this section, I won't be editing in many screenshots or anything of that nature, even though there may be some, and I will probably just overlay this audio onto gameplay of Deltarune. With that in mind, you do not need to watch the screen, and you can listen to this while doing anything else. I will put text on screen sometimes, but I will read it aloud. I just want the proof that it's in the game. But I should probably stop talking so much though, and get on with the actual bulk of this video. It's not going to be one theory, but a collection of multiple theories that I will gather into a timeline near the end. One that I think will make perfect sense for what is going on in the story. This will be at the latter half of the video, and will be a shortened timeline of everything mentioned here, just stating the facts rather than providing the evidence I already have. Although, of course, I will be splitting this video into separately digestible parts, time-stamped below for you to come back to at any time. Obviously, this means massive spoilers for all of Deltarune up to 2025, and spoilers for parts of Undertale. Without further ado, though, let's take one trip into this never-ending night, and see what lies in its depths. Part 1. Des is the Night. This one hardly needs any explanation, because I'm sure most people who would watch this would already know this, but just in case, I'll explain anyway. With the release of Chapter 3, it brought with it an actual look at who the Knight is, the first real enemy of the Fun Gang, and one with a very interesting design. The Knight, being the one who opened some of the Dark Fountains in the first place, is also the one responsible for most of the motivations of the bosses of these Dark Worlds. King, Queen, Tenna, and eventually they caused the eruption of the Titan at the end of Chapter 4. I brought up their design earlier, so let's get back to that, and why I think the Roaring Knight is actually Noelle's lost sister. To preface this, Des Holiday is Noelle's sister, and by the events of Deltarune she has been missing for multiple years, precisely 7. Why 7? I'll get back to that later. As it's heavily implied in Chapter 2, Noelle and Rudy speak of Des as though she's missing. It's unclear whether Des is dead or just missing, but it seems they don't know either. One particular aspect of the Holiday family is that they're all reindeer, and they all have antlers. However, who else seems to be possessing antler-esque protrusions from their head? The Knight. From their odd mannerisms, their scream reminiscent of the music Des listened to on the Dreamers TV, and their seemingly feminine shape, it's very clear that the Knight shares heavy traits with Des. If you want more evidence though, let's look at Spamton for a moment. Spamton has heavy connections to the Knight, likely being connected to them in some way, if not directly, much how Kris was likely the one talking to Tenna about a deal. It was likely another entity that made Spamton go mad while working with the Knight. This is what we in the showbiz like to call foreshadowing. However, when asked about the Knight, Spamton seems to know who they are and have likely communicated with them in the past. Why do I bring this up? Well, Spamton likely already knowing it's there, makes you bring him in a disc to the Neo suit in Queen's basement. When he acquires the Neo suit, he becomes Spamton Neo. In Spamton Neo's battle theme, there's lyrics that go as such. It pulls the strings and makes them ring. While I originally brushed this off as a line relating to the fact that the Neo suit is held up by strings, I now think it relates to more than that. While the "it" that pulls the strings implies control, which the knight is clearly doing, the second line about making said strings ring is odd to me. What does it mean, though? Usually when referring to strings ringing, one is talking about a guitar. Well, who owns a guitar? Des. This guitar seems to be a major part of who Des was, so for the lyrics to mention making strings ring seems to be very oriented towards someone who plays guitar, which is what Des used to do, as stated by Noel. Even if that's not enough evidence, I would like to note the oddly reanimated appearance of the knight. When it fights you in Chapter 3, the knight seems to be sluggish, almost hobbling like a corpse when approaching the fun gang, and even drooling for a moment, as if it lacks full control of itself. Then out of nowhere, its chest, which looks more like an exposed rib cage, bursts open, as it screams with an unhinged jaw at the top of the lack of lungs it seems to possess. If we go with the theory that Des is deceased, the seemingly undead appearance of the knight fits well with that. On top of that, the knight seems to wield what looks like a wiffle ball bat before it turns into a sword. Who else owns a wiffle bat? Des, which you can find in a room in Chapter 4. With all that out of the way, there's plenty of evidence to assume that Des is the knight, but how? What the hell happened? Well, I'll get to the specifics later, but I believe that Des's body and her soul are separate right now. The body, clearly, is possessed by some force that imitates an exaggerated version of who Des was before, along with the essence of something much more sinister. The soul, however, it seems to be lost in time and space, located only in the files, assuming the person in the files is Des. What am I talking about? Well, in Deltarune there exists unused text from an unknown person. Interestingly, the string that this text exists in increases in length with each new chapter release. Like this person is saying something new every time curious players inspect the data.win file of each new chapter. The text goes as follows. Chapter 1. Where am I? Hello? Anyone? Is anyone out there? Someone? Anyone? Can anyone hear me? It's dark. It's so dark here. Someone. Anyone. If you can hear me, say something. Please. Chapter 2. No one can hear me, can they? I guess not. To be honest, I'm not even sure if I can hear myself. It's so quiet here, and yet, sometimes, I swear I hear something. Something like scratching. Chapter 3. What is this place, anyway? How did I get here? As if I haven't asked that question a billion times already. I always did have that nightmare. Walking into the darkness, with the light shining from the doorway. Then the door slams behind me, and everything goes black. Is this that nightmare? Or was everything else a dream? Chapter 4. I'm starting to lose track of the time. Has it been days? Hours? If someone told me it's been years, I might believe them. Before the sun came up, so many wonderful things happened that made time meaningful. Things like breakfast or late night TV. In this place, I don't eat or drink anymore. I can't tell if I'm awake or dreaming. I can't even tell if I'm dead or alive. It's just nothing but pitch black silence. Except for the noise. The scratching noise I sometimes hear. This sounds crazy, but even though no one can hear me, when I hear that noise, I feel like someone's listening. Anyone, if you're there, thank you. The text implies that this is someone who used to be conscious, someone who used to live in the light world. I've seen speculation that this is Susie at the end of the prophecy, but frankly, I think it would make more sense for it to be Des. Des used to be close with the Dreamer family, and much like Susie, probably enjoyed breakfast there often and fell asleep watching the TV with Kris, Asriel, and Noelle. I believe Des and Susie share many parallels, and that's probably why the past couple chapters have shown Susie specifically doing things that the mysterious voice in the files talks about. It's pretty heavily implied that Des has the same badass attitude that Susie has, which would explain Noelle's attachment to her. But that's my evidence for why Des is the knight, but if there was an event that caused Des to become this, what transpired to make it happen? And moreover, what was the aftermath? Part 1.5, The Des Conspiracy. Well, I'll tell you what more than likely happened with that. Carol Holiday, Des's mother, more than definitely went on an investigative spree after Des's disappearance. This is evidenced by the fact that she has a large tack board inside of her bedroom, something which is usually associated with investigation or theories. The common take is that the tack board has something to do with Des and her whereabouts. In Chapter 4, Carol Holiday has a very, very obvious connection with both Kris and the Knight, as Carol was likely sent to the Holiday residence by whoever Kris was talking to on the phone, while the soul was out of their body. I don't think Carol is the Knight, because it seems too much like Carol is being used as a red herring for the identity of the Knight. It wouldn't make much sense, though, given the Knight's playful personality in connection to Des's hobbies. No, Carol is likely just in contact with the Knight and went home early from work to stop Susie from grabbing Des's guitar and looking inside. But why would Carol be in contact with the Knight if it wasn't Des? Or at least a part of Des? My working theory is this. Carol is working with the Knight and knows about their existence, as she knows that the Knight is Des's body, and probably also knows how Des became that way. Why would she work with her knowing that if her daughter's dead? Well, what if Des isn't fully dead, and Carol knows there's a way to bring Des back out of wherever she is? Carol seems to also know about Kris's soul, as when Carol stops Kris on the way out of her house, she says this: "As you know, you are welcome here anytime," with the second "you" being in full caps and in full red text. There's a few interpretations to this, but it seems as though the most common one is that Carol is referring directly to you, the soul, the player, when she says this. But how would she know that Kris is being controlled by someone that's not themselves? What if she watched it happen, or made it happen through some means? Perhaps Carol was involved in the making of something dark, yet darker. Part 2. W.D. Gaster. Is he in Deltarune? And why? So, I know I left on a weird note with that last part, and it seems weird that I brought this up right after that, but I promise you I'm getting somewhere. If you want to get straight to the actual explanation for why I think Gaster is in Deltarune, skip to that part in the description. Otherwise, I'll now begin explaining who Gaster is. For those of you unaware of who W.D. Gaster is, since I know that some people I have likely sent to this video don't, allow me to explain. W.D. Gaster is a character from Undertale. However, you will not find the slightest smidgen of info about him while playing the game. Instead, info about him is locked behind a certain luck factor, named the fun value. At the start of every save, you're assigned a number to your profile, from 1 to 100, and this value determines whether or not you find secret events in your playthrough. In some of these secret events, you can meet with NPCs that don't normally appear, and seem to be visibly altered variations of other NPCs. These NPCs speak of a man, one named W.D. Gaster, who was the royal scientist before Alphys. These people, referred to as Gaster followers, have this to say. Gaster Follower 1. It makes sense why Asgore took so long to hire a new royal scientist. After all, the old one, Dr. Gaster, what an act to follow. They say he created the core. However, his life was cut short. One day, he fell into his creation, and will Alphys end up the same way? Gaster Follower 2. Alphys might work faster, but the old royal scientist, Dr. W.D. Gaster, one day, he vanished without a trace. They say he shattered across time and space. Haha, how can I say so without fear? I'm holding a piece of him right here. Gaster Follower 3. I understand why Asgore waited so long to hire a new royal scientist. Previous one, Dr. Gaster. His brilliance was irreplaceable. However, his life was cut short. One day, his experiments went wrong, and, well, I needn't gossip. After all, it's rude to talk about someone who's listening. As is made clear by the text, Gaster either died in his creation or was irreparably warped across space and time by it. But what about his work before the accident? As stated before, Gaster was responsible for the creation of the core and was likely taking residence at the lab. But what's in the lab? The True Lab, of course. Descending into the True Lab while playing Undertale, you can find various lab entries detailing experiments done by order of the king. Among these experiments, you will find entries about experiments conducted with an artificial form of determination. Most would assume that these lab entries are entirely written by Alphys, the current royal scientist of the Underground. However, according to a theory video by Sock Muppet on YouTube, this might not be the case. According to the video, Sock Muppet theorizes that Gaster may have been the one to write the first entries in the True Lab, and Alphys wrote the rest after his disappearance. If this theory is true, which I believe it to be, then that means that Gaster also worked with determination. It's also implied that these experiments with determination were actually successful, and, as theorized by a YouTube comment made by Psydraco, I couldn't help but think of the Goners as additional candidates for Gaster's determination experiments, never forgetting the kindness that he had given them, with Goner having a double meaning too. This seems to be the general consensus among many others who watched the video as well. After creating the core and while writing these entries, they randomly stopped and seemed to switch authors. Well, one may ask, what was the last entry that Gaster wrote? Does it have anything to do with his disappearance? Well, it seems that a lot of these entries are written by Gaster, with some being written by Alphys if viewing them in numerical order. Specifically, when looking at both the typing style and the specific wording used by the authors, it seems that Gaster wrote entries 1 through 8, then 14 through 16, with Alphys writing 9 through 13, and then everything from 18 onward, with the main switch being from entries 16 to 18. Wait, 16, 18, where's 17? What the hell is this room that's in the code? Entry 17. Dark, darker, yet darker. The darkness keeps growing. The shadows cutting deeper. Photon readings negative. This next experiment seems very, very interesting. What do you two think? This seems to be the last entry made before Gaster's disappearance, his falling into his creation, as the follower put it. Alright, I know this part is in Undertale. Oh, what the hell does this have to do with Deltarune, one may ask? This is a Deltarune theory, isn't it? Why the hell are you bringing up old theories from years ago? I want you to pay very, very specific attention to entry 17, and tell me if you see anything specific. If you know what I'm getting at, wonderful. If not, it's okay. This is a recent realization for me too, and I just very recently picked up on this. I want to quickly highlight the 2nd through 4th line. The darkness keeps growing. The shadows cutting deeper. Photon readings negative. Seems to be a lot of talk of darkness, right? Kind of reminds you of a dark world. Well, what are you talking about? Dark worlds are a Deltarune thing. Yeah, just because he's talking about darkness in this, that doesn't mean he's actually talking about a dark world. Does it? Let's look very momentarily at Ralsei's explanation of the Dark Worlds from Chapter 3. Quote, "You see, Susie, you and Kris live in the Light World, a place where everything is as you see. That is, as long as there's light. You see, when it gets dark, things become more indistinct. A chair can look like a monster. A poster can look like it's moving. Your eyes can't see the truth. And when light runs out, you see nothing. Of course, your mind can't make anything of nothing. But what if? What if it became even darker? Darker than dark. What if we could take away the light that wasn't there until we reached another side? If that were to happen, you could start to see things again. And hear them. And feel them. That is the dark world, Susie. An alternate view of reality through the lens of shadow. In other words, an illusion. The dark fountains change everything into a fantasy. Huh, what an interesting thing for him to say. The dark worlds are created from negative light? From taking away light from already pure darkness? Wow, that's pretty crazy, isn't it? You know what else would be considered negative light? Negative photons. Gaster directly states that the readings are showing negative photons, which would be something that sucks light away. Wow, that's pretty on the nose, isn't it, Toby? I'd also like to bring up the fact that during the scene with Rousey, the song Flashback Excerpt seems to have a very, very interesting leitmotif, one that I will be bringing up later. A lot. But let me give a quick summary of Gaster's theme from Undertale. In Undertale, you can stumble across a sound test room provided you have the correct fun value. In the sound test, there are 4 songs to choose from. Happy Town, Meat Factory, Trouble Dingle, and finally, one last song, Gaster's theme. Take note of that motif. Now, let's listen to Flashback Excerpt. Notice the motif? How odd. Gaster's theme plays during a scene where Rousey is talking about a world created from negative light, something which is dark yet darker. Seems way too on the nose to me. Maybe it's bait, maybe it's not. Who knows? Saving that for later, though, let's talk about Gaster's further involvement in Deltarune. Do you remember the very start of the game? The starting sequence? A voice talks to you in all caps in very slow, methodical speech, as implied by the fact that its typing speed is slower than other characters. This seems very reminiscent of Gaster's time typing in Entry 17, right? Along with that, it seems to have a fascination with the word interesting. From the Goner Maker sequence, it's very clear that you're speaking to Gaster. If that evidence wasn't enough, the theme that plays during the sequence is called Another Hymn, and in Undertale, the file name for Gaster's theme from the sound test menu is called hymn.ogg. It's very clear that Gaster is speaking here, but I will acknowledge the possibility of this being a red herring. I think it's extremely unlikely, though. Anyways, this voice appears again in chapters 3 and 4. When exactly? Well, the first time is when you attempt to fight the knight beyond the first attempt. When you retry the fight and lose a second time, the soul appears on screen. Same with the voice from the Goner Maker sequence, who I'll refer to as Gaster for convenience. Now, here's what he says. On the first loss, very interesting. Your loss here is all but guaranteed. And yet, you persist. If you are so determined to try once more, then shall we hasten? On the second loss, and so, you meet with the same fate. Shall you try once more? If you lose without the Shadow Mantle, very interesting. You are missing something important. You won't win like this. Still, will you persist? If you lose on the final attack, incredible. I felt it there, shining. Your power. A little further. That's a little interesting, isn't it? How he eggs you on. How he encourages you to attempt to defeat the knight. That's odd. He doesn't seem to have this dialogue unless you actively choose to keep fighting the knight. If you don't retry the fight, you'll never see that dialogue. No. He doesn't say anything, because if you don't actively try the fight again, you'd never be the type to find any other secrets. No eggs, no crystals, no alternate routes, nothing of that nature. But why would he want that? And why exactly does Gaster even appear here at all? What role does he play in all this? Well, to answer that question, it seems that Gaster may have more importance than just being the voice. Why do I think this? Let's take a look at Chapter 4's ending. Quote, "Well done. The halfway mark has been attained, but it is still waiting. How much longer now? My Deltarune." While this piece of text is cryptic as all hell, all signs are pointing to something, but before I get there, I have to talk about something very quickly. In Undertale, Gaster seems to have a very heavy connection to the number 666. He's also stated to have fallen into his creation, or falling down. Clearly, it's starting to be made apparent that Gaster seems to be correlated to Satan, who fell from heaven. I mean, both have attempted to circumvent their world's rules by attempting to attain a godly status. Satan, who wanted to usurp God's throne through rebellion, and Gaster, who wanted to bypass the laws of death and become a god of the underground. Both fell from grace, and both are shadows of their former selves. But what was Satan before he fell from heaven? An angel. What if Gaster is the angel? What if Gaster is the one foretold by the prophecy to bring about the angel's heaven? It's clear that the angel isn't a god, and it's clear that the angel's heaven is a concept entirely separate from what heaven is. And, okay, I know that sounds crazy as all hell, but honestly, I think the connection is there. I think the connection is there. How would Gaster be the angel, though? What would have led him to become that? Well, let's refer back to entry 17 and his mention of negative photons. Look, I think it's apparent that this is Gaster creating his own dark fountain. But aren't dark fountains a Deltarune thing? Well, what if they aren't? If they aren't, though, then how would Gaster have made a dark fountain? It seems pretty convoluted to make one, and you wouldn't be able to make one if you didn't know how to, but what if the means to make one were discovered by accident? It's clear someone had to have done it first, right? Before I get to this next part, and I know I do this a lot, but I like having backing for the points that I bring up before I bring them up. And I need to say this. In Chapter 2, what does Queen say about opening a dark fountain? Quote, "That is when I realized this power of the will, this power of determination. Is this something that all Lightners possess? If one was simply determined enough, could not anyone make a dark fountain?" Previously, I assumed the dark fountains were made from determination after watching Susie make one in Chapter 4, but Queen directly says it right there. Fountains are, in essence, the projection of determination, something which sucks in light, and something which consumes all light around it. Now I'll bring it up again. What was Gaster studying before he was shattered across time and space? Determination. It's abundantly clear. Gaster, while experimenting with determination, accidentally opened a dark fountain. While he was experimenting, he was getting readings on the interior of the dark fountain, but eventually he was consumed by it. Now, what happens when a monster tries to seal a dark fountain? We don't know, or at least we've never been shown it. However, isn't it clear? Gaster was shattered across space and time. He was left in the code. He became part of the world's logic. What if that's what happens when a monster attempts to seal a dark fountain? I'm assuming determination is also needed to seal a dark fountain, since determination is a trait only humans possess in good quantity, and only humans can seal dark fountains. What if Gaster used the determination he collected from the DT extractor on himself to attempt to seal the dark fountain, but it wasn't enough? So, while the dark fountain was sealed, he was shattered across space and time with it. But what's to say the same happened in Deltarune? Nothing is for certain, but it's made clear by earlier statements that Gaster plays some role in Deltarune. What if it's nearly the same role that he played in Undertale? We know that whatever role he played, Alphys was replacement. So what if he was the school's teacher before Alphys? I mean, we know that Alphys hasn't been in hometown for too long, so clearly someone was doing her job before her. But why does Deltarune have to relate so closely with Deltarune like that? You're assuming that everybody has the same role that they did. But I remember very clearly a certain turtle saying something along the lines of, "Stories can be rewritten. They can be retold." This seems more like Toby talking directly to the player rather than Gerson saying something to Susie. In fact, the entire Gerson fight seems to allude to this fact. It seems to even be the main theme of the fight. The fact that stories can be rewritten, retold, and that the prophecy is something that should be thrown away to create a new story. With all the mentions of the Lord of the Hammer, Dragon Blazers, and the prophecy itself, it's clear that Toby is alluding to the fact that Deltarune and Undertale are two sides of the same story, and that there are even going to be two sides to Deltarune's own story. After all, the two are anagrams, aren't they? And I'm probably going to stretch this whole stories can be written concept pretty damn far, so just bear with me on this, alright? I'm getting somewhere, I promise, and I promise that it makes sense given the explanation. Anyways, getting back to the whole Gaster teacher thing. What if Gaster also did research on determination in this world? After all, most of the hometown residents share very close fates and roles as their Undertale counterparts. What if Gaster had a similar fate in this world? Opening a dark fountain and shattering across time and space? But how does that relate to Carol? You started this whole thing by saying that Chara was somehow involved in the creation of something dark yet darker, but you've been ranting about Gaster this whole time. What the hell does Gaster have to do with the Death Conspiracy? I'll get there in a minute, again, but first I'd like to direct attention, again, to something that I'd neglected to mention before. Let's take a trip to Undertale. Specifically, let's take a trip to Snowdin Town. One of the first things you encounter in Snowdin upon entering is a small shop. Inside the shop, there's a rabbit woman as a shopkeeper, and serves as the first shop you can actually interact with. Here's what happens when you interact with her. Upon entering the shop, quote, "Hello, traveler, how can I help you?" End quote. And if you say hello, quote, "Hiya, welcome to Snowdin. Can't remember the last time I saw a fresh face around here. Where did you come from? The capital? You don't look like a tourist. Are you here by yourself?" End quote. And if you say what to do here, quote, "You want to know what to do here in Snowdin? Grillby's has food, and the library has information. If you're tired, you can take a nap at the inn. It's right next door. My sister runs it. And if you're bored, you can sit outside and watch those wacky skeletons do their thing. There's two of them. Brothers, I think. They just showed up one day and, well, asserted themselves. The town has gotten a lot more interesting since then." End quote. Now, taking a look at Grillby's, specifically Toby's Fangamer comic, detailing each of its regulars, there's something interesting to see when looking at Sans' profile. It goes as follows. Quote, "The first day he appeared, he sat down and said, 'I'll take the usual.' Acting like an old-time customer, he often made everyone laugh, so he was quickly accepted as one." End quote. That's just part of it, but that's the part I want to focus on. Okay, I know it's just Sans joking around and doing his usual stuff, but what if by chance it's more rooted in reality than he'd let on? Sans has a tendency of making everything into a joke, even serious things at times. So what if that's indicative that maybe, just maybe, he's not even from the underground? I mean, he just appeared one day and acted like he already knew everybody. What if he did? What if he already knew them even if he didn't know them? What if he'd already met these people? What does that mean, though? What are you getting at? This Sans is the exact same Sans from Deltarune. No, I don't mean he's an alternate universe counterpart, I mean that they are both the exact same person. Undertale Sans is the aftermath of Deltarune Sans. Why though? Well, let's look at the evidence. First, let's look at Sans himself in both games, in release order. You'll see why. In Undertale, Sans is nonchalant, aloof, he's the jokester. He knows more than he lets on, and is often seen being calm in even the most serious of situations. He's mature though. He has the knowledge to read expressions perfectly, even being able to read how many times you've died in his fight through FRISK's facial expressions. Even in his interaction in the MTT restaurant, you can tell he knows more than he lets on. With his comment about, "Oh, you haven't died yet, have you?" He speaks about Toriel, how he met her, and how they started bonding. He says that he made a promise to her not to hurt FRISK, but says that if he hadn't made that promise, FRISK would have been dead where they stood. But why would Sans be so willing to listen to that? Why would Sans trust Toriel so much as to refuse to hurt Frisk until the very end of the genocide route? And what would have made Sans react so extremely to seeing Frisk initially? I mean, Sans does say that his comment was a joke, but was it really? What if he'd seen something like that before? What if he knew Toriel before? Now let's look at Deltarune Sans. In Deltarune, Sans is noticeably less aloof, less knowledgeable, and seems to have a harder time interacting with people as well. He seems to be able to mask himself less and have a noticeable lack of the same consideration he has in Undertale, as proven by the jitterbug scene. In Undertale, Sans probably would have considered Susie's feelings and encouraged Toriel to check on her. So isn't it strange that this iteration of Sans would be so dismissive, so irresponsible, immature? Well, frankly, I think that this is Sans before experiencing the character development that would lead him to become so analytical, so knowledgeable and collected. In this world, Sans is different. He's not keen to let Papyrus meet new people. He barely knows anyone besides Toriel, and is absolutely less ready to actively read people like he does in Undertale. This is highlighted especially by the fact that when you bring the box of heart candy to his shop, he freaks out. Or not freaks out, but he doesn't know how to respond. When you're standing at the counter in a shop in Chapter 2, you can use the heart candy in front of him to prompt him to speak. Quote, "What? A heart-shaped box of chocolates? Oh, I get it. Wow. You're really... Alright. Okay. You want to make a return on these, don't you? Okay. No need to break my heart. Here's $5. End quote. Such an odd reaction from Sans, right? Gone is the aloof exterior, instead replaced purely by shock. It's clear that such a thing shocked him to his core for some reason, so it's clear that doing random things as Kris does not have the same effect as doing random things as Frisk. Also, side note, Sans' monologue in Undertale in the MTT restaurant has the theme, "It's raining somewhere else," while the song right before Jitterbug scene is named "The Place Where It Rained." This seems extremely on the nose, so keep it in mind, especially the fact that the place where it rained seems to be in the past tense, speaking from the future. Maybe there will be a song called "It's Raining Here" in the future, maybe in the latter part of Deltarune. But perhaps the most damning piece of evidence that Deltarune Sans becomes Undertale Sans? In the final corridor, during a pacifist neutral route, you can speak to Sans and repeatedly reset in that room to trigger new dialogue. Eventually, Sans gives you the key to the back room of his house. Inside, there isn't much to see, besides tiled floor, unremarkable drawers, a curtain, and a counter with a strange blueprint on it. Inside one drawer is a badge, another is a photo of Sans smiling with people the protagonist doesn't recognize, interacting with the blueprint, and seems to be in strange, unreadable symbols. However, after speaking to the clam girl and hearing about someone's daughter named Susie, something changes. When you interact with the binder of photos featuring Sans with people you don't know, you can see something really interesting. In the card sticking from the back flap of the binder, you can see a poorly drawn picture of 3 smiling people with the words, quote, "Don't forget," unquote, written in lowercase. Sans' signature speaking style, his writing style. I mean, come on, this is obviously the Fun Gang. I don't even need to explain this one. How I see that going down was more than likely Sans drawing a picture of the Fun Gang after events transpire that transport him and Papyrus from Deltarune to Undertale. It's clear that Chapter 5 will be focusing on Asgore's jealousy of Sans and Toriel, so clearly Susie is going to interact with him and bond better with him, and the rest of the Fun Gang will do the same, including Kris, who is going to need to accept the fact that Toriel and Asgore aren't together, and that Sans is going to take Asgore's place, and that Kris will never have their normal back, since clearly Deltarune has heavy themes of escapism and is more than likely going to conclude with that escapism being broken down, so that Kris can move on with their life. But How would Sans have even gotten to Undertale from Deltarune in the first place? Well, this is the last part of this section, so I'll make it quick. Deltarune is very clearly a time loop. There's going to be some cataclysmic event that results in a time loop, and clearly Gaster is actively working to subvert that time loop. But why does that relate to Sans? Well, it's been theorized that Sans and Papyrus are related to Gaster for a long time now. More than likely, Gaster is related to them, and as such, Gaster will have a natural bond with them. In fact, I believe that the house that Sans and Papyrus live in was originally Gaster's, and that when Gaster disappeared, they slowly began to move over, eventually settling into Hometown. Through some way, Gaster is likely in contact with Sans, and is likely having him help set steps of the prophecy in place. I think that Sans' uncharacteristic inconsideration to Susie was likely a result of Gaster telling him to distract Toriel and keep her away from the church even after the rain settles. He keeps Toriel busy, keeps her in the house, while Susie walks away. Okay, I think I've talked about Gaster, enough for now. This part of my script is damn near 13 pages long, so I think I should get to a better question. Part 3. Why is Kris not in control of their soul? In Deltarune, it's abundantly clear that Kris and their soul are entirely different entities. I don't even need to explain that in detail. This is just made obvious by Chapter 4 and even some of the previous chapters. But why? Why is it like that? And how does that even work? I mean, Undertale made it very clear that while the soul of a human can persist outside of the body can't really persist without the soul, can it? So how does Kris get away with it? At the end of the first 2 chapters, and primarily in the 4th chapter, Kris is shown to throw their soul out of their body and trap it in a cage. Yet, without their soul, they move around and even seem to have a will of their own, being able to shuffle around and play piano in Noelle's home when they force their autonomy. Getting back to that question later, because I think there's one that needs to be answered before that, how can Kris and the soul be 2 separate entities in the first place? Why do you operate Kris's soul, but Kris can't operate their own soul? Isn't that like the fundamental rule of souls, that the person who owns it is meant to be able to control it? Is a person not their own soul fundamentally? Well, what if Kris's soul wasn't actually originally Kris's soul, or somehow Kris's soul has been altered by something other than themselves, something that allows Kris to persevere without a soul, perhaps a sort of determination. I mean, there's good evidence to suggest that most of the roles from Undertale are mostly similar to the ones of Deltarune, and what happens at the very beginning of Undertale? A human child falls down a hole into the core of a mountain, a drop which should be deadly for anyone, but it wasn't. The human, FRISK, awakes on a bed of flowers after surviving that deadly fall, but something's different. They're not in control of their own body anymore. Instead, you, the player, are in control of their body, and you act through them to progress the game up until the very end. No matter what, until the very end, it's you, the player, enacting your will. No matter what, you can do whatever you want and choose your ending, whether you spare or kill everybody. But there seems to be something interesting throughout your journey. Whenever you interact with something, there's narration. Odd, isn't it? Sure, it'd be one thing if it were just a game thing and it was obligatory, but why does it have a personality? And whose personality is it? Well, here's what I think. I think the Narrator theory is true. And I won't pad this section out, because this video is already going to be long enough. Just as I'm recording right now, it's like 40 minutes long right now. So I'll just link you to a better video I found afterward if you want a better explanation. But first off, let's see the genocide route. This is the most clear-cut evidence that, at least for some parts of Undertale, Chara, or the first human, if you don't believe that Chara is the first human's name. Yes, I know it's pronounced Chara, but I've always liked the pronunciation Chara more. They're for certain the narrator. Especially in the New Home segment, Chara is blatantly talking about their own experience living in the Dreamer household. They even appear at the end of the route, which further supports that Chara was at least narrating some of those segments. but there are also lines in which Chara is narrating during monster encounters, most likely. Especially in the genocide route, the prompts you get when using the check act are very clearly Chara speaking. For example, when you check Papyrus in the genocide route, the text says, and I quote, "forgettable." And that's it. Cold, straight to the point, like the rest of Chara's narration. Obviously, this isn't to say that Chara is the narrator for all of Undertale, since the narrator has meta-info that neither Chara nor FRISK would know, like being able to read people's minds, or just knowing things that neither of them should know. So if you want more info on that, like, please watch the Soph's video, is Chara the narrator of Undertale, parentheses, kinda, ... not really, parentheses. I'll link it below. But why do I even bring that up? Why does Chara matter to this, and why am I bringing this up after talking about FRISK falling down? Well, to be blunt and answer immediately anymore, since I'm tired of saving more for later, I think FRISK died, or at least was near the verge of death when they fell onto Mount Ebott. I mean, who would survive that fall? They fell down the center of a gigantic mountain onto a little bed of flowers and just survived with nothing wrong? I highly doubt it, but it is a video game after all, and there doesn't have to be lore explanations for everything, but what if there were? I mean, how would Chara even get into FRISK's soul in the first place? Well, where were they buried when they died? Let's quickly take a look at some dialogue from Flowey in the genocide route, right after you kill Sans and right before you reach Asgore. Quote, "You understand, Chara. I've done everything this world has to offer. I've read every book, I've burnt every book. I've won every game, I've lost every game. I've appeased everyone, I've killed everyone. Sets of numbers, lines of dialogue, I've seen them all. But you're different. I never could predict you, Chara. When I saw you in the ruins, I didn't recognize you. I thought I could frighten you, then steal your soul. I failed. And when I tried to load my save file, it didn't work. Chara, your determination, somehow it's even greater than mine. I just have one question for you, Chara. How did you get back to the ruins from here? Wait, I know. She must have taken you when she left, and decided to give you a proper burial rather than hanging out in the basement forever. But why then? What made you wake up? Did you hear me calling you?" End quote. Clearly, FRISK's falling down was the reason Chara came back. In Undertale, falling down is often used by monsters to describe a near-death state, as seen in the True Lab, when the earlier entries detail how monsters were brought back to the lab to discover a way to reverse this condition, as ordered by Asgore himself. And what was the discovery that reversed the condition of near-death? That condition of falling down? Determination. Extracted from human souls, the power of determination, or D-termination, was what brought these monsters back from near death and gave them the power to persist. I think this is paralleled directly with FRISK's falling down. Clearly they were near death after falling down, so I believe that some form of determination is what brought them back to life. Well, how would they have gotten that determination? Do you remember the other part of the determination research in the True Lab? Entry 8. Quote, "I've chosen a candidate. I haven't told Asgore yet because I want to surprise him with it. In the center of his garden, there's something special. The first golden flower that grew before all the other ones. The flower from the outside world. It appeared just before the queen left. I wonder, what happens when something without a soul gains the will to live?" End quote. Entry 10. Quote, "Experiments on the vessel are a failure. It doesn't seem to be any different from the control cases. Whatever, they're a hassle to work with anyway. The seeds just stick to you and won't let go." End quote. Entry 18. Quote, "The flower's gone." End quote. Clearly, this is how Flowey was created. By being given enough determination, even an inanimate object can be brought to life. And if not An inanimate object can sap determination out of someone. But how does that relate to Chara? Well, in the New Home segment of Undertale, the monsters give a sort of backstory to the underground, the events before Undertale. And it goes something like this. Quote, "A long time ago, a human fell into the ruins. Injured by its fall, the human called out for help. Asriel, the king's son, heard the human's call. He brought the human back to the castle. Over time, Asriel and the human became like siblings. The king and queen treated the human child as their own. The underground was full of hope. Then, one day, the human became very ill. The sick human had only one request: to see the vat of flowers from their village. But there was nothing we could do. The next day, the human died. Asriel, racked with grief, absorbed the human's soul. He transformed into a being with incredible power. With the human soul, Asriel crossed through the barrier. He carried the human's body into the sunset, back to the village of the humans. Asriel reached the center of the village. There, he found a bed of golden flowers. He carried the human onto it. Suddenly, screams rang out. The villagers saw Asriel holding the human's body. They thought he had killed the child. The humans attacked him with everything they had. He was struck with blow after blow. Asriel had the power to destroy them all, but Asriel did not fight back. Clutching the human, Asriel smiled and walked away. Wounded, Asriel stumbled home. He entered the castle and collapsed. His dust spread across the garden." End quote. Okay, maybe I didn't need to read that entire section, but I do just love this part of the story, and I kind of wanted an excuse to read more of it out. Anyway, there's a few key things to note here. One, that Chara was the fallen human. Let's get the obvious out of the way. Even if Chara isn't their name, let's just go under the assumption that this is the first fallen human. Two, Chara specifically stated they wanted to be laid to rest in a garden of flowers. Golden flowers that they could only find in their village, as the monsters said. Number three, Asriel laid Chara on those flowers and then delivered them back to the underground, where they both passed away in the garden. Well, why do I think these were the golden flowers? Where was Chara's body? First it fell with Asriel in the king's garden, then Toriel took the body and laid it to rest in the ruins. And where is every place the flowers appear? The ruins below the entrance to the underground, where Chara is currently buried, or was before the start of the game, Waterfall, for reasons we'll get to later, and New Home, around the King's Garden, where Asriel fell. Well, why do those two things correlate? Let's look back at the lab entries, specifically entry 8, lines 3 through 5, and entry 10, lines 4 through 5. Quote, "In the center of his garden, there's something special. The first golden flower that grew before all the other ones. The flower from the outside world," end quote. Then from entry 10, quote, "They're a hassle to work with anyway. The seeds just stick to you and won't let go," end quote. Clearly, these golden flowers were not here for long, and that first flower was clearly from the outside world, brought down to the underground. Remember when Chara was laid on a bed of golden flowers? Well, the seeds are sticky, so clearly the seeds stuck to their body, and when Asriel dropped them in the king's garden, the flowers grew there. Then they grew in the ruins when Toriel brought their corpse from New Home and buried it in the ruins. Why do they appear in Waterfall, though? Well, when Alphys was experimenting with the flowers, she commented that they stuck to her, and as we know, Alphys sometimes visits Waterfall to decompress, to think. It's obvious Alphys was the one to deliver these seeds to Waterfall, especially considering that those flowers are in the exact spot she sits to decompress, as we see in the pretend date. Why does it matter where the golden flowers are, though? Why do the golden flowers matter at all? Well, I think they have determination in them. Simply because of the fact that every single golden flower was grown from the seeds stuck to Chara's corpse. That's probably why the DT experiments didn't work on the flower, because the control group also all had determination on them. And if they all have determination on them, what's to say that determination from Chara's soul didn't leak onto Frisk's body to prevent their soul from shattering from the fall? Is Chara's soul the embodiment of determination, as is implied but never directly stated? I think so, at least. It's not confirmed totally that the red soul embodies determination, but considering it's one of the main themes of Undertale is determination, that's not a far stretch. After all, Chara fell down, was injured, and didn't die from the fall, even though there were no flowers to break their fall. I think their soul being the embodiment of determination explains that perfectly, and that the essence of their soul seeping into the seeds of the flowers after their death makes perfect sense. So, from the flowers that seeped into Frisk, who was near death and, quote, fallen down, now they have the essence of Chara's soul, determination. Thus, why they are filled with that power, why they persist after death, why they can save and reload, all of it. Frankly, I think that Frisk either A, lost their soul completely, as in it shattered before being brought back through determination, like we see in the Azrael fight, or B, their soul never shattered, but was redeemed from nearly shattering by the determination in the flowers. That's really the only way I can explain why the player, and by extension Chara, since as the player, you get to name the first human, so it would make sense that you control Chara in that world. Technically, Chara is your player character. And, you know, while I did come up with most of that part on my own, my decision to include all of this in the video came from 2 comments made by @RossOriginals on that Is Chara the Narrator Theory video I brought up earlier. Quote, someone probably pointed this out, but golden flower seeds are sticky. All the golden flowers in the underground came from seeds stuck to Chara's body. End quote. And the second comment, quote, oh man, Chara attaches to Frisk through the seeds, end quote. But how does that relate to Deltarune? Well, what if the same thing happened here? What if, right before the events of the game, Kris endured a catastrophic event that left them near death or without a soul, and somehow the determination from something else was what entered their body? I mean, in both games you control the soul of a human, you get to name them, do whatever you want, because even in Undertale you do not get to choose who you are. You are Frisk, and in Deltarune you are Kris. It would make a bit of sense, wouldn't it? After all, there's pretty sizable evidence to consider that Frisk and Kris are essentially the same person. If you want more info on that, watch Kris is Frisk by golden_anomaly. But I will say again, this theory is more than likely true, because Chapter 4, by far the most lore-heavy chapter, implies a heavy theme of stories being rewritten, retold. So odds are, Undertale's connections to Deltarune are going to have a way heavier part than people originally thought. After all, the game starts out with saying that if you haven't played Undertale, you probably should. You're probably meant to notice parallels from that game. So how the hell does any of that relate anyhow? What would have even been the catastrophic event that took place? Well, let me introduce you to the first Fun Gang theory by Lorefax TV. I'll give an abridged version, but I'll also give my own take on what happened based on everything I've discussed before. The theory goes as follows. So, as Chapter 3 has revealed, the song Raise Your Bat is likely something referencing Des, since the scene directly before has Tenna mention Des right before playing this song. And the song has a lot of imagery of something like a video game, or maybe even exploring a dark world. You know, all the talk about, oh, a soul lighting away, or raise up your bat and fighting enemies, or whatever. As evidence shows, Kris, Noelle, Des, and Azrael used to be really close. Des and Azrael specifically might have even been romantically close. They also used to play games together, a lot, specifically Dragon Blazers. And you know what Dragon Blazers is based on? Lord of the Hammer, which is based on Deltarune's prophecy. As the theory goes, one day, Des and Azrael were likely playing Pretend one day, and either stumbled upon a dark world located in a bunker, which I find unlikely for reasons I'll discuss later, or opened their own dark fountain, which I believe more. Well, why do I think this? Opening a dark fountain isn't hard. All you need, according to Queen, is determination, and all Lightners have some form of that. It's likely something transpired where Des and Azrael, probably Azrael, stabbed something into the ground, likely role-playing as the sword magician that he apparently liked, and opened a dark fountain that way. Asriel, as evidenced by the fact that he has Sham on his wallpaper, and as pointed out by Susie, was probably close with Sham, and was probably also using him to play pretend. Well, what happens to objects in a dark fountain? They're brought to life. So in their usual fashion, and likely treating it as just pretend still, the theory proposes that, with Sham's assistance, Des and Asriel attempted to fulfill the prophecy. This is supported by the fact that Des and Asriel have drawings of a dragon under both of their beds, and Asriel, as of Deltarune's current events, rented How to Draw Dragons for almost 7 years, which is why I think Des disappeared around 7 years ago. Clearly, they were trying to fulfill the prophecy, and they already had dealt with King if they opened the dark fountain in the abandoned classroom like I assume they did. Sham states directly that Lightners had come to the Card Kingdom long ago and were a beacon of hope before they left, never to return to the Dark World, since they sealed it. Sham clearly has combat experience, since he fought Jebel, possibly along with Des, Asriel, and Kris's soul, more on that later, and likely served Rousey's role as Darkner Mage. Des served Kris's role as a knight, and Asriel was likely the combat mage, what Susie was or is in the current day and age. As much as I believe this theory, I can already see some counterpoints to it, and questions. First, how did they seal the Dark Fountain? Kris's soul, more than likely. How did they have Kris's soul? You're making it seem like Kris wasn't there, and that you're making a clear distinction between Kris and their soul. Des and Asriel definitely already knew about the prophecy because of Dragon Blazers, and yes, I'm saying Kris was without their soul for a time. The prophecy clearly says something about, quote, a cage with human soul and parts. So they probably literally took Kris's soul, which I assume was Asriel's idea because he has a history of going along with terrible ideas and being too timid to disagree. Maybe that was Des's idea, actually. Either way, they threw it in the birdcage that is still in the Dreamer's room. They probably brought it with them to the abandoned classroom, then opened the Dark Fountain. More than likely, they were already playing pretend with Sham as their third member of the party when they opened the Dark Fountain, so Sham didn't have to learn his role, and probably knew it the moment the Dark Fountain was opened, because Dark World seemed to have this uncanny ability of reading the will of someone's soul, their intentions, their knowledge, or whatever. So, focusing on the line from the prophecy, cage with human soul and parts, I could see the younger Des and Asriel interpreting that line a certain way. Cage being literal. As for human soul and parts, though, I could see that being interpreted as human soul being one thing, and then something else being parts. Well, what could be parts? Sham. Think about it. Sham's a sort of stitched-up ragdoll, right? He's kinda in parts, one could say. So there's the parts aspect of the prophecy. And as YouTube commenter at Sir Lamington states, quote, calling it now, the cage really does apply to the birdcage in Kris's room, but it was used as a lantern in the Dark Worlds in order to light the hero's way. Who wielded it? Sham, the shopkeeper who just so happens to have a theme literally named Lantern. Thank you for attending my TED Talk, end quote. Of course, Des would be the girl with hope crossed on her heart, and as the theory states, Asriel is the prince alone in deepest dark, since Asriel just had the role of the prince of the underground in Undertale, so he likely had the same role there, being, you know, he was the son of Toriel and Asgore, and was probably somewhat alone for a time, kind of like Kris is before the start of Deltarune. Anyway, after sealing the Dark Fountain, they probably left Sham in the abandoned classroom since, you know, they likely looked at the cage with the human soul and parts line a second time and decided, you know, maybe we could just take Kris instead, because taking their soul seems kind of bad and we don't know the long-term effects this is going to have. And the only reason I assume that is because Sham doesn't know Kris when they come to the shop in Card Kingdom. So I assume Sham only ever saw Kris's soul, not their body. After exploring around a bit, since Des, Asriel, Noelle, and Kris were known to do that, side note, I don't think Noelle was around for the Card Castle Dark Fountain, and I think Des would be too protective of Noelle to bring her into the rest of the Dark Fountains they'd open. Furthermore, there are only 3 heroes, as told by the prophecy, so Noelle couldn't have fit in any role. Anyway, back to the topic. The first fun gang, which I'll just call the first gang now for convenience, were likely roaming around and exploring when they came across the shelter. Suddenly an idea. Hey, what if we open a dark fountain in the shelter? What could we find in there? But they didn't have the code, did they? Well, both Asriel and Des are related to people who knew different parts of the code, and another part of the code is written on the back of a fire extinguisher in the church, which is not very hard to find, so it wouldn't have been hard for them to access that code. So, with Asriel and Des stealing the code from their parents, the first gang entered the shelter and opened a dark fountain. Now, what the theory states is that what was in this dark fountain was much more dangerous, more sinister than the card castle dark fountain they'd opened before. Personally, I agree with this completely, because it seems like the shelter's dark world is going to be the final area, and will likely be the hardest area in the game. Unfortunately, this means that the first gang have done a little too much open world exploration and have stumbled upon the end game far too early. Eventually, they got to the end of this dark world, and while trying to seal the dark fountain, ended up failing in some way. Somehow, Kris's soul wasn't enough to seal the fountain. They might not have been used to it, or they may not have just had enough time. So, while Kris was attempting to seal the dark fountain, Des tried to use her own soul to seal the fountain, which didn't work because monster souls don't have enough determination to seal dark fountains. And, okay, back up. Little explanation time. Why does determination have to do with any of that? Alright, quick side tangent here, explanation. We know determination makes dark fountains. We know Kris's soul emits light. It's pretty clear that determination can actually be both, since darkness is just a measure of light. And darkness doesn't actually exist, since it's just an absence of something that does, much like how cold is another form of heat. So, if determination can produce light, it can take it away. Anyway, back to the explanation. Des attempted to use the light of determination to seal the dark fountain, which didn't work, shattering her soul across space and time, and leaving her body without a soul. However, according to this theory, this opened a small rift in the dark world, allowing for an opening for Asriel and Kris to escape. However, while Asriel was trying to allow Kris the ability to seal the dark fountain, Asgore, the chief of police, noticed the unlocked shelter while on patrol and pulled both Asriel and Kris out of the dark world, leaving Kris's soul inside of the shelter. What I think happened is the soul didn't shatter, but it was severely weakened, to a point of near shattering as it desperately clung onto life. So Asriel and Kris get pulled out of the shelter, and Asgore leads them home to scold the both of them for entering the shelter without permission. However, both the soul and Des are still in the shelter, so later that night, Asriel sneaks out of the Dreamer household to retrieve both. Okay. This is starting to get into pure speculative and fanfiction territory. We might have gone way past that at this point, but I think this is the only way to explain how the parts that came up next even happened in the first place. Anyway, Asriel gets Kris's soul and hides Des's comatose body, since I think she's comatose here rather than dead. I also think in the Snowgrave route, Birdley, quote, dies in the dark world while going comatose in the light world. My honest thought is that his soul somehow shattered. Asriel, racked with grief, attempts to find any sort of way to restore both the strength of Kris's soul and find some way to bring Des out of her coma. Well, why didn't Asriel just tell Carol and Asgore? Well, in Undertale, he has a very prevalent habit of hiding things from people, especially if it'll get him and a loved one in trouble. This happened with Chara's plan in Undertale, which we'll actually get back to later. So Asriel has this habit of hiding crucial things like this, so it would make sense that he would seek every length short of telling Carol and Asgore the truth. But where do you seek wisdom from, if not your parents? Who is someone that people usually say you can trust if you need someone to talk to? Maybe a therapist, maybe a police officer, or maybe a teacher. But wait, who was I saying was the teacher before Alphys might have been? That's right, W.D. Gaster. Here's what I'm theorizing. What if Asriel went to W.D. Gaster for help? Told him, Mr. Gaster, I'm in big trouble and I need your help. And I know you're one of the smartest people in my life. So can you please help me find a way to bring Kris and Des back to normal? And of course, much like his Undertale counterpart, he accepted. This time from the prince, rather than the king. But where would one start? This is likely something that would have taken years to research, many tens of thousands of hours of time, because in this world, the concept of determination isn't so well known. Gaster had never needed to play God before. He had never had the responsibility of royal scientist. He was just a teacher. So until now, no one would have given him the mission of finding determination. That concept probably wouldn't have even occurred to him until years later. And so, years later finally came around. Asriel went to college. Here, he would meet someone, a human, namely Chara. Okay, I know people have joked about the idea of Asriel bringing Chara with him when he returns from college in Chapter 5, but honestly, I think that Chara is already dead in this world. And here's what I think happened. Asriel met Chara, they bonded since Chara reminded Asriel of Kris, and eventually Asriel would tell Chara the story of what happened with Kris and Des. So eventually, an idea would formulate. Much like the original variation, this incarnation of Chara would fall ill, either by intent or just circumstance. This time, however, instead of telling Asriel to combine with the soul, Chara would just tell him to bring their soul back to hometown, without telling anybody but the people who need to know. As regrettably as the Undertale variation of him, Asriel watched as Chara passed away, and delivered their soul to Gaster. The reason for this? Asriel had studied human souls. Since we can see talk of human souls in Hometown's library, it makes sense if there were other places where human souls were being, how do I put this? Studied. That might have been why he went to college, too, to study more about biology and human souls and whatnot. So, Gaster had also probably done this research, but neither of them had a human soul to extract determination from, since determination can only be created from what was once living. Now that Gaster had a human soul, though, this was when he could finally conduct his experiments with determination. What I believe to happen is that Gaster went to the shelter, and there was where he conducted his experiments. He would eventually create the Goner Maker, which is likely the Deltarune equivalent of the DT extractor from the True Lab, and would extract part of the determination from Chara's soul, experimenting with it to figure out the best dose to give to Des's comatose body. At this time, Des's body is nearly dead, if not fully dead, and is deathly thin. When Asriel brings the body to Gaster in the shelter, it is at this point where Asriel goes to Carol to tell her the truth. He brings her to the shelter, and she gives the final, desperate go-ahead to pump Des's body with determination. After having been lied to for years, and now knowing it was both Asriel and Asgore's fault, Carol fires Asgore. This news does not reach Asriel, as if it did, Asgore wouldn't be trying so desperately now to rekindle his relationship with Toriel before Asriel comes home. Anyway, Des's body, filled with determination, starts to reanimate. However, even though it has a similar will to Des, it's different. Fundamentally. It no longer had feelings. It no longer has hardly anything. Anything except the mind Des once had, rather than her heart as well. Just like Flowey, this incarnation of Des would become an object, a being without a soul, corrupted partially by the determination flowing through it. But why? Well, I think that the source of determination is more than likely something that plays a factor in how its subject is presented. After all, such a thing is explained by the creation of Dark Worlds, right? When Susie tries to revive Gerson, it doesn't work, because Susie didn't know Gerson that well. Not only that, the will of a Dark Fountain's creator also affects the way a Dark Fountain forms, the way it looks, everything. A Dark Fountain made from determination brings things to life, but so does raw determination. What if it's the will of the determination itself and the source from which it comes from that decides aspects of what it revives? What if objects made with determination aren't inherently heartless beings like Flowey? What if Flowey's cynicism, his carelessness, stemmed from Chara's natural feelings? Asriel makes it pretty clear that Chara wasn't the greatest person, even if they weren't evil. So what if Chara's natural pessimism, combined with Asriel's childlike curiosity created something that Flowey became. And what if the same is true for Des? Des clearly doesn't act the same anymore. They seem to have a sick sense of humor and act maliciously, deviously. Yet Des, as the knight, seems to be following some sort of other being's commands, like the angels. We know that Gaster is likely the angel, so what happened? Well, I think that Death Knight, albeit different, was willing to obey Gaster, because you can reason with things made from determination. Flowey clearly has the ability to be reasoned with. But Carol immediately knew something was wrong. Her daughter was different, corrupted. So she wanted Gaster to attempt to do something different. After hearing the story from Asriel, she now knew that Des's soul was likely stuck in the shelter's dark world. However, there was a piece they were missing. Kris's soul. So after getting Kris, Gaster had Death Knight open a dark fountain, and along with Carol and Kris, would explore to the end of the dark fountain once more, this time conquering it with Death Knight's abundant power. However, when it came time to seal the dark fountain, Kris's incomplete soul wasn't enough. While attempting to seal it, the light from Kris's soul wasn't bright enough. It was too dim, too weak. So in desperation, Gaster used his soul along with Kris's to attempt to seal the fountain, but that didn't work. Instead, Gaster shattered across time and space, much like his Undertale counterpart, leaving Carol and Death Knight to drag Kris's body out of the shelter. Now, they barely had any soul left, but still had one, mind you. So, after recuperating, Des, Carol, and Kris would attempt to visit Gaster once more after being called to do so. Now, Gaster had become the angel, the voice. He could extend his influence anywhere. So he offered a way to restore Kris's soul, under one condition: that the prophecy be allowed to set in motion upon doing so. So, months later, when Susie and Alphys had moved to town, Kris knew that it was time. They went to Gaster, and using the Goner Maker, had forced Chara's remaining soul into Kris's body, which reawakened Chara's soul. This is why you don't see anything from before Kris wakes up, besides the Goner Maker sequence. This is why you don't wake up before the sequence of the game starts. And it's timed right before the festival too. The perfect time to set in motion the sequence of events, and furthermore, right in time for Asriel to get home and see the conclusion of Gaster's plan take place. So yeah, that's what happened to Kris. That's why the player, or the fallen human, is the one controlling Kris. It was never a meta-narrative. You are controlling Chara, who is controlling Kris. That's why Carol refers to the soul when saying, "You're welcome here anytime," because she was directly involved with it, and knows that Chara is residing inside of Kris. She isn't talking to the player, just the soul, which I think is a way better way of revealing that than just it being the player. But first, let's go over the actual Goner Maker sequence very quickly, then we'll move to the next part. So, you remember the Goner Maker sequence, right? You, Chara, get to choose how your vessel works and whatnot, but at the end, the text changes. It's a different speaker, and you're told your creation is discarded and you can't choose who you are in this world. Well, I think this voice is Carol, telling Chara you cannot choose your body because you will become Kris right now. And then right after, when Kris finally has a soul, they use it to seal that dark fountain. However, in exchange, Carol makes the Kris promise that they will fish Des's soul out of the dark fountain by any means necessary, which is why they needed the soul. So what does that mean for anything? What is Gaster working towards exactly, and how do the events of the game correlate with that? Well, let's get to that. Part 4. Gaster's plan. So, here's what I think the plan was, almost immediately. First, Kris is to seal the dark fountain, then go home and sleep, so that they can bring Susie to the dark fountain the next day. Death Knight opens the dark fountain in the storage closet. But wait, where does Ralsei come into play here? Well, people speculate that Ralsei is Kris's devil horns or Kris's knife, but I don't think it's either. I think Ralsei is actually a plush of Asriel, which is why he looks like that. We know that darkeners usually take the form of the object they're meant to represent, but Rousey doesn't really look like a knife, and Kris doesn't wear devil horns anymore, so why a doll? Well, Rousey has a lot of plush comments made about him, and hell, even Spamton has, not Spamton, Tenna has an entire advert about a Rousey plushie. Sure, it seems like a gag, I get that, it's a Toby Fox game, but honestly, I think there's really is something to glean from that. Maybe Rousey literally is a plush doll, and no, after writing the script, I just now found out, like, recently, that this is genuinely a theory that people are having. I didn't even know that. I just came up with this one day because I saw all the mentions of Rousey being a doll in the Tenna minigames, but I saw it in the comments of the first gang video and had to do a double take. Anyway, from where though? Where would anybody get an Asriel plush, and why would there ever be an Asriel plush? Well, okay, this is going to be purely speculative on my part, so just bear with me. But you know how we talked earlier about how Asriel bonded really well with Sham? Well, I have a slight suspicion that the reason Asriel was so close with Sham was because someone actually made Sham for him. I mean, it's a patchwork, like, ragdoll. Clearly someone fixed Sham up, even if they didn't make him. So I feel like whoever made Sham would be able to make other things. And what was Asriel really into when Des was still around? Dragon Blazers. Odds are, Asriel was super into magic for a while, so for his birthday or something, someone made him a plush doll with him in a mage uniform, donning a red scarf. Actually, I feel like it might have been a Christmas gift, given the red scarf, because, of course, you'd make that in the wintertime. Maybe it was the Holiday family that gifted it to him? Who knows? Anyway, the knight creates the closet dark fountain after the shelter fountain is formed, which makes that not formed, closed, which makes that technically the first dark fountain, the pure fountain, since it's the only one in the world at the moment, the first one to be made in the sequence of dark fountains. Then, the Card Castle dark fountain is made. Then, Deltarune Chapter 1 happens, and yada yada yada. So, Deltarune happens, and the prophecy happens, but what could the plan even be? It's laid out pretty plainly in the prophecy that the angel wants to bring about the roaring, so what's there to debate? Well, what if he doesn't want to? There's many theories and plenty of evidence to suggest that Deltarune is a time loop, so what if Gaster is in an Eren Yeager Attack on Titan situation, where once he becomes the angel, he's basically locked in a time loop, where, quote, it's too late for me to stop this. But how did Eren Yeager escape the time loop? By committing mass atrocities and doing literally everything in his power to subvert fate. And what is Deltarune's main message? What is the first thing you hear when you're in the Goner Maker well, not the first thing, but one of the biggest things you hear in the Goner Maker sequence? There is only one ending. What if Deltarune is a time loop? What if that's true, then there is only one ending. And what is that ending? Well, something that would only be achieved if you did everything optional. Everything to subvert the expectations of the game, the prophecy. And what would that be? Well, first, let's talk about shadow crystals. First, who are the shadow crystal holders? Jebel, Spamton, the Knight, and Gerson. And what's the common theme between all of them? They all either want to subvert the prophecy, or they're working for Gaster, who wants to subvert the prophecy. We know Gerson hates the prophecy, and we know the Knight is working for the Angel, but what do Spamton and Jebel have to do with anything? Well, Jebel went insane after meeting a strange man. Clearly he met Gaster, who gave him the Shadow Crystal and injected ideas in his head of being free while being caged. Clearly targeted towards Kris and their soul. And Spamton? Well, the Addisons say he called a strange man one day, and after that, went insane. When they checked the phone, all they heard was garbage noise. The same noise you hear from your phone if you try to call in the Dark World. Spamton is told about the Neo suit, and along with Kris, works to acquire it. Then, Kris is sold. Spamton is held up by strings and yells about freedom while being hung by those strings, claiming he would be free if the Lightners cut them. And when that finally happens, Spamton falls to the ground. his freedom being his undoing. Guess what? He finds a shadow crystal in that suit. Now, how does Kris react after this fight? Violently. Very violently. Not because they're worried about the soul, but Gaster. Spamton was controlled by Gaster, but when he got to a point where he could achieve the promised freedom, he fell apart, unable to move, a broken puppet left to rot. What if the same thing happens to Kris? What if the method for achieving their freedom from the soul's control is what ends up being their undoing? The knight is obviously related to Gaster. This one hardly needs any explanation. I talked about it earlier. And Gerson, yeah, he said the same thing about rewriting stories and saying screw the prophecy, so no manipulation was needed there. But what else is a part of the plan? What other ways can one subvert the expectations of the game? Snowgrave. The weird route. But what makes me think Gaster would want that? Well, if you fight the knight without the shadow mantle, he will say you're missing something and encourage you to go get that. But where do you get the shadow mantle? The game that very, very obviously hits at the Snowgrave route, of course. And it also hint extremely heavily at the Undertale genocide route, but that's only very slightly related. So Gaster is encouraging you to do something related to Snowgrave, and locking the only way to collect that shadow crystal behind it. Well, it seems pretty on the nose to me, but why would he do that? Well, not only is Snowgrave clearly an alternate route to the game that subverts all of fate, since in Chapter 2 you never actually get to see Queen's Chariot, but there's also an interesting item when you play through Snowgrave. The Thorn Ring. Why does that matter? Well, when you visit Malleus's shop in the recent chapters, you get an interesting option for fusing items. First is the Thorn Ring, and second is something called the Pure Crystal. Well, my best guess is that the Pure Crystal is the sum of all of the Shadow Crystals, and when you combine it with the Thorn Ring, you get something called the Twisted Sword. What that is, I have no idea, but considering it's a combined effort of both of the things that Gaster encourages you to do, either through NPC interaction or whatever else, I assume the Twisted Sword is what will end up being the thing that cuts through the boundary of fate. It will be the sword that banishes the angel, the sword that pulls death out of the code, the sword that will help the conclusion of this game's one real ending. Also, side note, let's talk about Gaster's theme very briefly since I brought it up before. I don't even need to explain this one, I just want to point out the songs that have Gaster's motif in them and let you come to your own conclusions. First, Another Hymn, the song that plays during the Goner Maker sequence. Then Scarlet Forest, the second area and the first possible place you can find the key pieces without already knowing the combination in the field. Then there's the Circus, which is the theme that plays when you find Jevil, a shadow crystal holder. Darkness Falls, the song that plays when you press Give Up in the Game Over menu. Then there's the World Revolving, which plays during the Jevil fight, right before you get his shadow crystal. Then there's Girl Next Door, which is related to Noelle. It's Noelle's theme, and she's the focus character during the Weird route. Then there's Big Shot, the song that plays when you fight Spamton, another Shadow Crystal holder, Dial Tone, the song that plays in Spamton's shop where you can buy the key gen to fight him later. And then there's Flashback Excerpt, which I brought up before, which plays during Noelle's encounter with Kris in Chapter 2's hospital after talking to Rudy during the Snowgrave route. Then it plays in Chapter 3 when Ralse is explaining how Dark Worlds are formed, and then during Tenna's monologue about the family splitting up. Then, the last time I've heard this song was when Noelle is telling her story of Kris the night before Chapter 4's Snowgrave, right before the soul enters Kris's body and forces the Thorn Ring onto Noelle. Then there's Northern Light, which plays during the Mantle game in Chapter 3, which relates directly to the Snowgrave route. Glacier, which also plays during the Mantle game in Chapter 3. And then finally, Catswing, Mike's theme. What does Mike have to do with Gaster? Okay, I'm gonna keep it a $1.50. I have no idea, but it's clear Mike had involvement with Spamton and Tenna, and is probably what made them go partially mad. He pulled some of the strings and was probably had his own strings pulled by the angel. Also, the Shadow Mantle clearly summons entities that looks like one of the Mikes, so I feel like that's related to it too. I'd also like to bring up that sometimes when you look through a Shadow Crystal, you will see scenes from the Snowgrave route, even if you're not actively doing it. For example, Noelle whispering to you, which is what happened in Chapter 4 Snowgrave route, or Susie looking mad at you, or you'll see things from an otherwise violent route, like Tenna's death. Coincidence? I think not. They're too correlated. So yeah, that's my thoughts on the stuff going on in Deltarune. As for future chapters, I have no idea. Chapter 5 is going to be focused on Asgore and the festival. That much is clear. But as for after, haven't got a damn clue. So, since that's done and over with, I suppose it's time to summarize everything so far, and then give my own take for what I think might happen. Now, without further ado, the Strider's Ultimate Deltarune Theory fanfiction whatever the hell timeline. This is the timeline that, in my opinion, pieces together all parts of the story that haven't been told yet, or haven't been explained. Some with evidence, some with pieces that I've written to explain elements of the story that have no evidence. So please bear with me here. Part 5. The Timeline. Let's start before the story. First, Kris is adopted into the Dreamer family. They are the only human in hometown. Then the Dreamers bond with the Holiday family. Kris, Asriel, Des, and Noelle get close. Asriel and Des bond especially well, get very close to each other, and start getting very involved with a game called Dragon Blazers, even beginning to pretend to play the game in real life. At around this time, Des and Asriel are likely around 11 to 12, and Kris and Noelle are likely around 9 to 10. At this time, Asriel and Des make it very apparent that they love going around and playing pretend, even dragging along Noelle and Kris on their wild adventures through town and even into nature. Des, the girl with hope crossed on her heart. Asriel, the prince alone in deepest darkness. And, fulfilling the first hero of the prophecy, Asriel and Kris find a way to drag Kris's soul out of their body, eventually stuffing it inside of the birdcage that's in their room. The cage with human soul. Along these adventures, the same person who made Asriel's prized stuffed doll, Sham, makes another one. One of Asriel, in mage attire, with a red scarf, likely during the holidays. One day, while playing pretend in the abandoned classroom, Des and Asriel accidentally open a dark fountain. In there, they find many strange beings, personified variations of real-world items. They treat it like a game, using Kris's soul to light the way. Eventually, they stumble upon Sham and immediately welcome him to the team, as Sham had likely been the mage even before the Dark World, during their pretend adventures. Sham, becoming the parts aspect of the first hero, is tasked with using Kris's soul to light the way, as his lantern. As such, the trio become their own heroes of the prophecy, and proceed to seal the Dark Fountain in Card Castle. When Asriel and Des make it back to the Light World, they immediately start drawing out parts of the prophecy. The dragon, the queen, the screen, and everything else. They go back to the first Dark Fountain, interject the dragon into the story to fall more in line with the prophecy, stopping the dragon and the king to seal the Dark Fountain. During this time, they take Sham along with Kris's soul back home. But then an idea strikes. Hey, what if we take the school's laptop to the Card Castle? So they do that. This is how Queen meets King, this is how Jebel meets Queen, and Task Manager, and the same happens with Sham and Queen, which is how Sham knows Queen. Then they fulfill that part of the prophecy and leave the Card Castle, leaving Queen with King, and Sham with the Card Castle, as that is where he belongs. Yet, a thought strikes the first gang, while watching TV just as they always did. Hey, the prophecy says something about a Lord of Screens cleaved red by blade, right? So, while Toriel and Asgore were away for a few minutes, the first gang opened a Dark Fountain, this time allowing Kris to use their soul instead of bringing it with them in the cage. Instead, In this part, they use Kris's body as the cage, since they reinterpret this as human soul and human parts. Upon doing this, the Dark Fountain reveals Tenna, the Lord of Screens. This is where Kris meets Tenna, and where Tenna meets Spamton, a spam email on the computer in Kris and Asriel's room. The first gang eventually fights and defeats Tenna, continuing the prophecy. Eventually, after their adventures and while exploring around hometown, they stumble upon the shelter. Des using her mom's part of the code, Asriel using his father's part of the code, and both of them using the church part of the code written on the fire extinguisher, open the shelter and bring Kris along with them, with Des opting to leave Noelle at home once more, as she's very protective of her younger sister. The first gang makes their way through this dark world, hacking and slashing through the likely most dangerous dark world they could have possibly entered. At the end of their journey, after the trio had been bruised and battered and beaten nearly to death, they find the Dark Fountain. They tried to use Kris's soul, but for some reason, whether it was by Asgore's intervention as chief of police, or by the enemies that lie within this dark world, Kris was unable to will their soul to banish the Dark Fountain. In a final act of desperation, Des attempted to use the determination from her own soul, as the girl with hope crossed on her heart. Unfortunately, Des's soul wasn't enough, and her soul shattered across space and time as she fell into her creation, her Dark Fountain. While Kris and Asriel were attempting to banish the Dark Fountain with Kris's soul, they were pulled out of the Dark Fountain by their father, leaving Kris's soul inside for far too long. Asgore drags the siblings back to their dreamer household and scolds them, while Kris struggles to maintain composure, and Asriel attempts to de-escalate the situation. Later that night, Asriel sneaks back out of the house to retrieve Kris's soul and Des's body. Kris's soul now is fragmented, barely living and barely breathing, and Des is in a comatose state. For now, Asriel hides Des's body and returns his sibling's soul to them. Even though it's only a fragment now, it still works the best it can while supporting Kris's life. Years later, racked with irreparable grief and desperate attempts to recover Des's soul, Asriel turns to his teacher, Mr. W.D. Gaster. Gaster, of course, has had many years of scientific research and has cemented himself as the most brilliant man in hometown. Gaster promises Asriel that he would work on a way to return Des's soul. However, he had no way at the moment to do so. Asriel also requested a way to return the full essence of Kris's soul, which was also promised. After graduating, Asriel applies for college, and right before heading to college, he has an aching guilt in his heart still. Even though he has desperately tried to make it up to Kris, even though he has desperately tried to make himself a model person, he still cannot accept the fact that he allowed Des and his sibling to get hurt. So, to alleviate this guilt, he finally spoke to Carol Holiday, Des's mother. He confessed everything, including Asgore's involvement, leading to him being let down from his position as chief of police. It was at this point that Asriel would let Carol in on the Des revival plan, and would then head off to college to allow the both of them to pool their resources together while he spent his free time attempting to study the human soul. It was during this time that Asriel would meet a human named Chara, who would become his best friend during the time he spent there. Asriel would tell Chara stories of Kris, which to Chara would hit close to home, seeing as how they also had been abandoned mostly by humanity as well. One day, Chara would fall ill, and an idea would strike, one that most would consider questionable, if not terrible. They would ask Asriel to deliver their soul to hometown to be used in research, to bring his sibling's soul back, since they wouldn't be able to use it anymore regardless. After Chara's death, Asriel would deliver their soul to hometown, relaying his information to Mr. Gaster, who would start work on a machine to extract the determination from the fallen human soul. This machine, of course, would be dubbed the Goner Maker. During this time, Asriel would return to college and would not reappear until far later. With Carol's permission, Gaster takes Des's now dead body and pumps determination into it, which forms it into the Knight, a demented caricature of Des, something which, while having most of Des's personality, has been corrupted by the spirit of Chara. Carol takes note of her daughter's change in both form and personality and speaks out against it heavily, saying that they need to recover the soul too. They ponder for a while, and they decide they need to open a dark fountain. However, as Asriel said, they need a human soul to do it, so they grab Kris from their home and take them to the shelter. Upon doing so, they open the shelter's dark world, and with the new knight's aid, they face the dark world and attempt to retrieve Des. Upon making it to the end, catastrophe strikes. As Kris's soul was too weak, too dim to cast aside the shadow born from the fountain. In an act of desperation, Gaster would attempt to combine himself with the parts of determination he had extracted, which in process would shatter his soul across time and space, opening another rift in the dark world, which Chara would use to pull both Kris and Death Knight out of the dark world, abandoning Gaster and leaving him in the dark world. Chara's soul, which was still inside, would take a while before eventually figuring out how to seal the dark fountain, but by that time it was too late. Gaster's entire body had shattered along with his soul, which meant they were unable to use the determination to revive him. Now, Gaster, with his superior knowledge, had combined with this world's rules, its systems, and in self-fulfilling fashion had become the Angel of the Prophecy. As the Angel, he found Des but would not communicate with her. But he let his existence be known to Carol. No, her existence be known to Carol, who would make it her sole mission to follow his word and get Des out of the dark world. Kris's soul, still incomplete, would be unable to seal another dark fountain. But as the Angel, Gaster knew that it wasn't yet time to enact the prophecy and set events in motion. No. He needed something first. He needed ways to bypass the prophecy, ways to technically adhere to it while subverting the expectations of it. His reason for doing so being the forbidden knowledge granted to him upon becoming the Angel, that the prophecy results in a time loop, that there will never be an ending to this world's story. This obviously doesn't sit right, so he ponders ways to subvert the prophecy and bring about another course of action. Then came the day. Susie arrived in hometown, and there was a peace. They had found their ticket, their ambiguity. Now between Susie and Noelle, they could switch out the girl with hope crossed on her heart. Now they could establish one thing, and then switch it out to fully subvert the prophecy itself, to enact a series of events which would bring about the defeat of the Angel, the banishment of the Angel, and an end to the prophecy. Gaster would then call his two relatives, Sans and Papyrus, and would tell them to set up shop in his old home. Now it was time for Kris to finally gain the ability to seal dark fountains, and to begin the sequence of events which would be called the prophecy. One night, Gaster would call Kris and tell them to come to the shelter, for it was finally time to regain their soul's power and set in motion the prophecy. During what would become the Gonnermaker sequence, Death Knight would be tasked with one thing. You must create the prince, and you must bring these shadow crystals to beings with power. Any beings with power that you know from the dark worlds that you've explored. So, Des would seek to find a prince, but the only one she knew was Asriel. So she went to the Dreamer's house and found the old doll of Asriel that someone had made for him years ago. She set it in the storage closet, and now that all the other dark fountains were gone, it was time to reopen them, to create the pure fountain. The fountain made out of all of... The first fountain made out of all of the current fountains. As Dark Worlds seem to have an uncanny sense of the creator's will and seem to be able to transmit info even without presence, Ralse is created by the Knight and is given all of the info about the prophecy, about Dark Worlds, and about his role. Ralse, being created, now shares a personality, both with the version of Asriel that Des knew, the sweet, caring young boy, and the Asriel that Chara knew, the guilt-ridden, broken, self-sacrificial man. This innocence and combined maturity these two different points of life would collide to create Ralse, a distorted version of the previous prince. In the room over, the abandoned classroom, Des would open a dark fountain, which would give Sham all of the info he needed to know, but would also cause Jebel to go insane upon acquiring a shadow crystal, upon being influenced by Gaster, the Angel. Sham, unfortunately, would be required to defeat Jebel and lock him away. King, now remembering the abandonment by the other Lightners and not recognizing Des, would overthrow the other kings and throw the Card Kingdom into chaos. Jevil, who had spoken with the angel, had his mind corrupted by the ideas of freedom and being free while caged, a message meant from the angel for both Kris and Chara. After the events of Chapter 1, Des would open a dark fountain in the library's computer lab, where Queen had recently been donated from the school to. This leads to Queen taking over as ruler, and Spamton losing his position as the big shot all over the computers in the cyber world. Then, when down in the dumps, Spamton would receive a phone call from the angel and would promptly go insane, ranting and raving about the suit they needed to find, the one that would make him a big shot, that would grant him his freedom. One, fortunately, that the angel knew about due to his connection to the Dark Worlds. The angel knew that somebody had created that suit before. That someone had likely created that suit as an idealized version of who they wanted to look like. Someone that I believe is the nobody that is in Napstablook's home, who Metaton would be in another life. This, of course, you know, would lead to the Spamton fight. And also the realization that Kris, just like Spamton, is a puppet on a string. And if the angel's plan works out, they will fall as well. Maybe not physically, but mentally. They will have to enact things that would kill them inside, that would kill their heart. An evil root that would break them. Then in Chapter 3, the Mantle game appears, which was inspired by an old game that Kris and Azrael made before, but was corrupted into a message by Gaster. And the Mantle piece as part of Chara's determination, similar to Flowey in another universe. Kris would explore this game, and by that way would give Chara the knowledge to reset and go for the Snowgrave ending, the other part of Gaster's plan, the plan to switch the girl with hope crossed on her heart. At the end, the Knight would fight the Fun Gang, but the Knight would be told to allow Kris the chance to acquire another Shadow Crystal if they were determined enough. A test to see if the soul itself were willing to carry out the forbidden path in this timeline. In any timeline. In Chapter 4, Gerson's hammer is dug up by the Knight and given life in the Dark World, as Des likely knew him very well, as Lord of the Hammer inspired her favorite game. However, Gerson, while still mostly himself, was given some sort of different view of things. If encountered, Gerson would start speaking about how Susie must rewrite fate with hope, and if you complete the secret battle and get the Shadow Crystal, he'll tell Susie that she's now the dragon, and not the girl. And that will set in forth the further motion of the angel's plan, as Susie is no longer the girl. She's the dragon that needs to be stopped, and now Noelle is the girl who finds love. Level of violence, not love. Noelle finds power, not comfort. And now we're here, at the end. That's it. That's the timeline so far. So what do I think the next sequence of events will be? Well, it'll be focused on Asgore for one. Azrael will be coming back, and it will be taking place in a burning flower field of jealousy. I think that Azrael is going to die. I think Asgore is going to watch Azrael die, and Azrael will come back as Flowey in the Dark World or something. And that will be where you get the Shadow Crystal. Azrael will come back and ask about the soul, revealing that twist, and revealing that he knows, and Asgore will be given the role of king in his flower field. Okay, what's gonna happen to Undyne? They kidnapped her in Chapter 3, so what's gonna happen to her? Well, she's gonna be killed. I'm gonna say that first and foremost. She is going to die. Her soul is going to be shattered, and her body is going to be punked full of determination like her Undertale counterpart. As for the Tale of Hell, no earthly idea. But if these theories are true, then I know how Deltarune's real ending is going to happen. And it has something to do with the wording, quote, the angel banished will meet with its desire. In all other iterations, it implies the angel has already been banished and its desire is the roaring. But in the true ending, the interpretation is that the angel will be banished, likely by the twisted sword made from both the thorn ring and the coagulation of the 5 shadow crystals needed. So yeah, that's it. Guess I'll get into some bonus things that I wanted to talk about now. So this is going to be a sort of bonus things, you know, Q&A part. So getting out of the way, since I can probably come up with my own answers to most questions presented here. But I don't know all of the questions that can be asked. So I suppose I'll pose my own counter to these theories. First, where's Papyrus? You mentioned he was related to Sans and Gaster earlier, but if Papyrus is in on the plot too, then why isn't he doing anything? Well, I think he's the mystery Eggman. He's the forgotten man, and he is what is referred to when you check the big closets in the computer room in the church, as both say they can fit a large man. They make that distinction very clear. Well, why is he there? He's probably just trying to see his dad, because it makes sense for him to know through Sans that Gaster's in Dark Worlds. But even if he's not, even if he's not doing that, he was probably told by Gaster to be there, because as he's noted, if you're on the weird route, something changes. You can't collect the eggs anymore. You cannot collect the moss anymore. So that is a hint that you are doing something different, and then the normal conventions of the game are no longer a thing. Papyrus can't even stomach to give you an egg anymore, because he clearly does not like evil people. Even if he thinks you can change, he will not reward you by being evil, so he'll disappear. And another point is that when you're in the dating sequence in Undertale, you can see an egg. I think that's pretty on the nose as is. So yeah, that's yeah. Anyway, next question. If your theories are true, then why are we controlling Chara? And why aren't they the same in every timeline? You can spare everyone, and you can hurt everyone, so what gives? Well, the same goes for Undertale. When I say this, Chara is the perfect neutral character, initially pessimistic but given hope by Azrael, so they lie somewhere in the middle. No matter what, the chance they take any option is 50-50, so there's room to move. Also, it's assumed that you, the player, are a third entity in this exchange controlling Chara. This part is known by none of the characters, though, I assume. This isn't to say that Chara is inherently evil or good, but they are neither. They are controlled by your will, your chances. And yeah, so branching off of that, why does Gaster feel the need to test you? Why is the ambiguity so out there? Well, if you're not going to do it in the first place, he knows that telling you would probably not work. No, he has to know that you're able to will yourself to do it in the first place, that you have real determination in your heart, and that you won't be back down when the plan comes. He has to know that you're going to think outside of the box, that you're going to explore these different paths, that you're going to do something different, that you're going to change this world. Well, why is he hinging on that, though? How does that work? Deltarune, as I said, is probably a time loop, where you're the only variable. So eventually, you will get it one day. This is why he shows up when you retry the night fight. You're breaking the expectations of prophecy, of the, quote, usual turn of events, and you're proving yourself to be different. You're proving to him that you are willing to think outside of the box, just like him, and that you're finally going to bring about the one true ending of this game. So, now that I've got those questions out of the way, I want to talk about the actual Snowgrave route and what I think about it given the interpretation I've now given over the course of the events. So, cutting to the chase here, when you say, I hear you, the game makes it pretty clear that your creepy voice is separate from Kris's, and that you, the soul, the player, are the ones saying that. I also might say that Chara, enacted by your evil will, might be changing, because Chara can make creepy faces sometimes, and has been known in Undertale to make a creepy voice. So yeah. So now that's out of the way, there's one big glaring question now. What is that red dot that appears every time a scene with Noelle happens in that chapter? Well, you know what I think? That is the bit of Kris's soul that's still left. The bit of Kris that's still holding on to life. Their heart, their emotions, their feelings. Its size is comparatively being trumped by the soul that now possesses their body. No, I don't think it's Noelle's soul, because monster souls are white, and I will acknowledge the possibility of it being the thorn, the blood on her hand, but no, I doubt it. But that raises another question. If Kris is in on the plan, then why do they have such a violent reaction to Snowgrave in the Mantle game if they know it's necessary? And why do they take it out on you? Well, I think that Kris was lied to. I think that Gaster knows Kris would never allow any of that to happen. So he's being intentionally vague with Kris too. Only telling them the parts that they need to actually know about, like when to open a fountain or when to attack their allies. See Kris / Theory for more, I'll link that too. But they're being fed lies. They didn't know you needed to do that, and you don't know you need to do that either. So the evil actions during the Snowgrave route are fully deserving of punishment by Kris. And I also want to note the Mantle game. You know, the part where Noelle gets used up, okay, I think she's going to get used up, but then Kris is going to get used up. I think in some way, Kris's soul is going to be used up in order to bring Des back. That Kris's promise is going to be related to that, and Kris is going to be used up and die by the end of the story. That's why there's all that missing hand symbolism that you see every time you hold a shadow crystal. That's why the Mantle game says that you're going to be used up. It's clearly referring to the Snowgrave route, the only real ending to the game. So yeah, I think Kris is going to die by the end of the game if you follow the Snowgrave route, and Noelle also. So yeah, I think that's about it. That is my full theory for all of Deltarune so far. If you have any questions, please ask me in the comments. If you have your own theories, you should also put them below. Someday, when this is all said and done with, I want to make an add-on to this video confirming what I got right and wrong. My honest guess for how accurate this is? Not at all. And that is intentional on Toby's end, and I credit him for being a wonderful writer. This is the story that makes sense with what we have been given, though. But we don't have everything, only foreshadowing. So you know what? I think I'm wrong on most of it. But I can't think of any better way to explain the story so far, so I'll assume I'm right. I'll assume that this is the intended way that you're meant to expect the story to go, because of all of the Twitter things and the wingdings that appeared on the Deltarune website before Deltarune even came out. Okay, it's clear that Gaster's the angel. That much is apparent. But as for everything else, whether Chara is in this universe or not, I don't know. Whether the first game theory is actually true, I don't know. But it is heavily implied, and it would make sense. It would make sense to me, at least. And I think the story would be better if it... not better, but I think it would be a good story if it followed that route. And this is the route that I think it's implied to follow. So yeah, that's my interpretation of events so far. And if you want my interpretation on anything else, because I'm gonna be honest, I will... If you give me a prompt, I will study my ass off on it, because for recording this, for writing this entire script or whatever, I've spent, like, 2 weeks scrolling through wiki articles and playing through the game and watching YouTube videos, and just, okay, I've done my homework on this, and this is the hardest work I will probably ever put into any project besides the book that I'm writing. But yeah, that's it. I can't even think of anything else to say. So, for now, I think it's time I quit speaking and go have a glass of hot chocolate. You know, just like Kris. So yeah, my name is Strider, and as always, please have yourselves a damn good one. Peace.